Hey everyone. So I wanted to make a video today kind of exploring an alternative to this idea that faith always requires belief. And this is an idea that's kind of been in the philosophical literature for quite a long time. However, a lot of people kind of throw out some, quick suggestions for what faith might be if it doesn't involve belief and then move on. So I want to kind of dive deeper into a very specific suggestion, the idea that faith could be based on some kind of credence. Belief and credence are a very important topic to a lot of my work, but so is faith. And so I kind of wanted to bring these three together today. So the goal I have today is to explore what beliefless credence-based faith might look like. So faith without belief, but faith that does involve credence. I want to raise a couple challenges or questions you might have about such a view, and then brainstorm some potential answers and responses. Okay, so just as a bit of background, very quickly, um, a lot of people make a distinction between what's known as belief, which is a pretty familiar attitude, often taken to be this kind of coarse-grained attitude that sort of flat out represents a proposition as true. So I believe I'm in my office. I believe it's 11:28. I'm sort of like representing those statements to be true. And a lot of people think really there's three attitudes that you can take to a proposition on this model. You can believe it, withhold on it, and disbelieve it. I have a lot of other sort of videos about those three attitudes, but the point here is it's kind of this coarse-grained, flat-out attitude, which contrasts with credences. So credences are similar to like a level of competence. And this is going to be a more fine-grained attitude that represents the subjective probability of a proposition, right? And so some of my credences might be 0 or 1, right? I might have a credence of 1 that 1 plus 1 equals 2, but there's like a big storm coming later, so I have like a 95 or a 0.95 credence that it's going to rain later this afternoon. And then, maybe a credence closer to 0.5 that like a fair coin will land heads, or I have an even number of hairs on my head, right? And so credences are much more fine-grained than beliefs. There's, at least in principle, an infinite number of credences you can take towards a proposition. And again, whereas with belief, there's really just belief, withholding, and disbelief. Okay, so that's belief and credence. And then just briefly kind of talking about faith, here I'll focus on attitude faith. So faith is like an attitude, something in your head, rather than faith as an action. And also focus on faith in propositions. You could have faith that something is true, or faith in someone or something. So I'll focus on faith that, or propositional faith. Really, a lot of people think faith has at least two components. The first is the conative component of faith. This is going to be kind of like the desire-like component. Desires are often taken to have a world to mind direction of fit. So if I desire food, I go out and get food. So the world sort of conforms to the desire that's in my mind. They're inherently motivational. When you want something, you try to go out and get it. It doesn't have to just be desires here, though. I think there could be candidates for the conative component of faith that are some like states that are weaker than flat out desires. But that's the first component of faith. A lot of people think faith views its object positively. I don't have faith that my friend has cancer, or that, my friend will never quit smoking, or faith that I missed my flight and now I have to get up at 3 a.m., right? That's because faith involves positivity or this conative component. Then there's also the cognitive component of faith, often taken to be like the belief-like component of faith. So this has the mind to world direction of fit, the opposite direction of fit. When I see a cup on the table, then my mind conforms to the world. I believe that there's a cup on the table. I see that the forecast predicts rain, so I believe that it's going to rain. So instead of me desiring something and going out and fulfilling that desire by making the world a certain way, it's the opposite. The world sort of conforms, or I'm sorry, my mind conforms to the world with the conative attitudes. And so these attitudes are often like considered to be broadly epistemic, aimed at truth. And so, we want to have true beliefs. Belief is taking something to be true, but credence is similarly, we want to be accurate, often taken to be synonymous with true. Okay, so most people think that attitude-based propositional faith has both of these components. But of course, there's lots of other components that people have proposed for faith as well. Might involve trust, risk, commitment, emotions, resilience, grit, etc. Right? So I'm not going to go into all the different accounts here, but I have cited some there. And a lot of people, not everyone agrees on these two components, but I would say they're pretty widely held, especially because they are both pretty flexible, right? You can say the cognitive component always has to be a belief, and then you can have a view where faith entails belief, or you could, allow for different types of belief-like attitudes to play that role, similar for the cognitive component. And so, not everyone agrees. So Malcolm and Scott famously argue that faith doesn't always involve positivity. I disagree, but most people in literature are pretty much on board with these two components. They just often will add more stuff. Okay. Okay, so a little bit about belief and credence, a little bit about faith. Now let's move to section 2. So why might you think faith could be based on credences? Well, a lot of people in the literature, and again, not everyone, but a widely held assumption is this idea that faith doesn't always require belief. So if you believe something, if you have faith, that's something you don't have to always believe it. And the view that I'm kind of tempted to is that in the same way, I don't think the cognitive component of faith has to always be a flat out first order desire, but it could be like a second order desire. It could be a belief about goodness. It could be some kind of other weaker pro attitude. I have a recent paper called Faith is Weakly Positive that just came out where I argue for this. I think that we can treat the cognitive component in a kind of a symmetrical way. And so the cognitive component of faith doesn't have to be a flat out belief, but it could be sort of various weaker cognitive attitudes. We'll talk more about what those might be in a second. So I like the idea that we could treat these two components of faith kind of in a parallel fashion. And that sort of motivates this idea that if the cognitive component doesn't have to be a flat out desire, perhaps the cognitive component doesn't have to be a flat out belief. Okay, so if we're that far, then you might say, well, what does beliefless faith look like? Right? We need some kind of alternative story about what the cognitive component of faith would be if it's not always a belief. And here I think a plausible thought is that if faith is possible without belief, then faith could be based on a credence. So credence still treats a proposition as likely, still acknowledges that you have a good bit of evidence for some proposition, but doesn't always require you to flat out believe something, right? You could have a relatively high credence that something is true. You could be relatively confident, but not flat out believe it. You could still say, I'm withholding belief, but I think it's more likely than not, or I think it's decently likely, right? Some people, Laura Bouchak, have even argued that you could have a super high credence, like 0.999 credence in P, like if that's based on something like statistical evidence, but not believe P. And we don't have to go that far here, but it's interesting to think about how high your credence could be without belief. But, you could definitely have various levels of credence above 0.5 without believing a proposition. So I think it's a pretty plausible candidate for a cognitive attitude that would be an alternative to belief. If, again, as we're assuming, I didn't really argue for that faith doesn't require belief. So I also think credences are a basis for action, right? They play a clear role in one of our best theories of action, decision theory. And so if faith can be based on credence, this can capture the idea that attitude-focused faith often leads to action, right? It seems weird to say, I have faith that something's true, but I've never acted on that. It's not an important part of my life. In my previous work, I've argued faith and commitment are closely connected. And so this idea lends itself to the thought that faith and action are closely connected. And even if we're doing, talking about attitude-based faith, I still think that often leads to action, right? And so this nicely fits with that picture, right? Then another interesting question. So if beliefless faith does need some kind of cognitive attitude, but that cognitive attitude isn't credences, you might wonder what else can play that role. So Alston talks about acceptance. That's acting as if a proposition is true or a commitment to act on a proposition. And he thinks, well, maybe that could play the role, but that's really more like an action or commitment to act than a cognitive attitude. So I don't know if that's quite the same thing we're getting at when we're trying to talk about the cognitive attitude that plays a role in faith. Poidman suggests faith might be based on hope. I think actually hope is a distinct state from faith that's consistent with even lower credences than faith is. I might briefly come back to that in a little bit, but the idea is like hope is much more like desire-like than it is belief-like. And so faith's going to be, hope is going to be more of a cognitive attitude than a cognitive one. So I don't know that that would be a good candidate. Probability beliefs, some people think you could have a 0.5 credence a coin will land heads, or you could believe the probability the coin will land heads is 0.5, right? So maybe probability beliefs could play the role. Well, I guess so, but wouldn't it be weird if probability beliefs played the cognitive role in faith, but credences couldn't? I don't see what would motivate that. And I haven't ruled out all the possibilities. Some people talk about beliefless assuming or conditional attitudes or attitudes of comparative confidence. This is more likely than this. And sure, like I'm not here to like rule all those out necessarily. Those are possibilities worth exploring. Absolutely. But I do think credence seems like one of the best candidates for the cognitive component of beliefless faith. Okay, so a little bit of like maybe motivating this idea that if faith doesn't require belief, faith could be based on credences. Okay, so I do think this view faces a couple unique questions or challenges. So I'll briefly talk about each of those. So the first worry has to do with thresholds. And more specifically, what credences in particular could play the relevant role in faith? How low could one's credence be, while one still has rational attitude-based faith in P, right? So it's kind of a challenge, like what credences are eligible, right, for this cognitive role in faith? And here, I think the answer is maybe not super exciting, that I don't think we're going to be able to determine an exact threshold, right? But I think if there is, there's a threshold for belief, which some people have argued there isn't actually, but even if we spot that, right, there's a threshold for, rational belief, or even just a threshold to be able to believe at all, your credence has to be sufficiently high. We could set the threshold for faith even lower because faith doesn't require belief. And so I think that's kind of interesting. It can give some kind of flexibility and steadfastness to faith that goes beyond the flexibility and steadfastness of belief. Your evidence and your credence get sufficiently low so that you can't rationally believe anymore, but maybe you could still have faith. So let's say it's weird to believe a proposition if your credence in it is below 0.5. Debatable, people have challenged this, but there's something plausible to that. If we think that, we wouldn't have to say that about faith. You could still have faith at P, even if your credence in P is like 0.4, for instance. So that's what I mean by faith allows for stability and flexibility, and perhaps even a way that belief doesn't. And at the same time, I think we could set the threshold high enough to allow for limits to how much counter evidence is possible for rational faith, right? So I don't think we should continue to have faith in light of any amount of counter evidence. If you just you have faith that your team is going to win the game, and I was just watching March Madness, right? They're down by 30 with a minute left. Like, yeah, you should probably give up your faith their team is going to win the game, right? And so perhaps, maybe a 0.1 or 0.2 credence is too low. And maybe you could have hope. You could hope, even in like hope your team somehow pulls it off, even in light of, I mean, that's an extreme example, but maybe a little bit more plausible case that's possible your team will win. That's all that hope really requires, is thinking that it's possible, right? And so hope might come in where your credence is too low to have faith, but there's still this interesting middle ground where you could have faith even without belief. And so I think this threshold concern, on the one hand, yeah, maybe we can't give an exact threshold, but on the other hand, it kind of has this nice middle ground role for faith to play in between belief on the one hand and hope on the other. Okay, so that's the first worry. I'm going to say these worries, I think, get harder as we go. The second worry has to do with instability. Okay, so the idea is that if your credences are rational, because they're so specific, so fine-grained, they're going to change with every small change in your evidence, right? As the forecast predicts a higher or lower chance of rain, your credence should change accordingly, for example. But faith seems kind of in contrast to this. So faith seems like a stable attitude that isn't constantly changing with tiny little evidential changes. And so you might wonder, how would credence-based faith capture the stability of faith if credences are constantly changing and faith isn't? Okay, here's my thought tentative thought. Perhaps faith as this broader, more complex attitude can be stable even if the exact level of credence playing the cognitive role in faith is changing. So as long as your credence doesn't go too low, you can continue to have faith, like we just talked about with the threshold thing, right? And then so this more complex attitude of faith itself could have a stability, even if this credence element of faith is changing and that's kind of playing the relevant cognitive role. So as long as it's changing above the relevant threshold, you're good. So here's an analogy that might help make this a little bit more clear. Let's say faith is like, it's being a nice day. I know it sounds like a weird analogy, but just bear with me. Many different temperatures can contribute to it's being a nice day, right? Some people like, it's when it's in the 50s or 60s, it's a little cooler, sweatshirt weather, but still a nice day. I prefer more like 70s. When it's warm out, if you're at the beach, maybe 80s, right? There's like a number of different temperatures that are consistent with it being a nice day. And throughout the day, the temperature can fluctuate, but it still is a nice day. If it gets down to like the 20s, it's not a nice day anymore, right? And so the idea is that like it's being a nice day can be stable even if the temperature is fluctuating. Also, it's being a nice day is going to be this kind of like more complex state than just like the exact temperature measured in Fahrenheit or Celsius or whatever. And so it doesn't just depend on the temperature, but might also depend on like whether it's raining or whether it's cloudy, right? A lot of people think it's not a nice day if it's raining outside. So that might be like the conative or desire-based element of faith, right? So hopefully you can see how faith can be stable even if the credence element is changing within the attitude of faith. So hopefully that makes sense. Okay. Question or worry number 3 has to do with error possibilities. Okay, so when you think something's likely or take it to be true, you can still consider, well, what if I'm wrong? P, but what if not P, right? It's sunny outside, but what if it starts raining later, right? God exists, but what if I'm wrong about that, right? I believe my spouse is a good person, but what if they're hiding from a lot of secrets from me or something, right? Those are error possibilities. And part of what credences do, with the exception of credence 0 and 1, those would be extreme credences, non-extreme credences make error possibilities salient. So when I say I believe P, you're kind of just like ruling out the possibility of not P, treating P as flat out true. Credences, on the other hand, if you have a 0.9 credence in P, you're saying like P is likely supported by my evidence, but there is a chance I'm wrong, right? So sort of credences by their very nature are sort of leaving these possibilities open. Okay. And you might think that's kind of the opposite of what faith does. It seems unfaithful to be constantly considering the possibility of error, right? If you're constantly wondering whether God exists, there seems like at least your faith isn't as strong as someone who's like squarely, like, no, God exists. That's like just flat out true for them, right? Constantly considering whether your spouse is a good person or your spouse isn't cheating on you. Like if you're constantly thinking about that, there's something that seems unfaithful about that. And so this suggests that credences on the one hand and faith on the other hand might be in tension. Faith is about flat out treating the propositions in question as true. Credences, except for extreme credences, which most propositions of faith aren't going to be cases of credence 0, 1, right? Those are going to be cases where the error possibility is salient. So how, like, you can't have an error possibility be salient, not salient at the same time. So what's going on here? Okay, this is, I think, a really hard challenge, and I want to keep thinking about it. So if you want to give suggestions in the comments for how I might respond to this, I'd love to hear it. But here's my tentative idea. Many contemporary authors that write on faith actually reject this idea that faith is incompatible with doubt, which I think is a related idea. A lot of people intuitively think, well, if you have faith, you don't doubt. If you doubt, you don't have faith. And I think contemporary authors say that's actually the wrong way to view faith and doubt. And in fact, part of what faith does is it helps us keep our commitments even in light of doubt. So faith is still stable and steadfast, but it's just possible that faith can coexist with doubt. And so this idea that faith and doubt are opposed to each other is actually the wrong idea. Okay. But I think this plays into this worry about error possibilities pretty cleanly, because doubt, part of what you're doing when you're doubting something is you're making salient an error possibility. You say, well, the package says it's supposed to arrive today, but Amazon is notoriously unreliable, and so I doubt that it will. So you're raising an error possibility. You're saying, says on the website it's going to arrive today, but I doubt it. So you're saying there's some chance that this is wrong, okay? But if we are already on board with this idea that maybe this thought a lot of people, I think, intuitively have about faith, that faith is incompatible with doubt, if we already reject that, then perhaps we should also just reject this idea that the faithful aren't going to consider error possibilities. Maybe faithful people actually do consider error possibilities more than we think. And faith is more about having that either stable attitude or stable commitment to act, even in light of some error possibilities coming in and being salient, at least sometimes for people of faith. Okay. And some people, notably Laura Bushak, have argued that faith involves taking a risk. That could be a risk in how we act, or that could even be a risk in what attitudes we take. So I think there's different ways to spell out the risk, but it's part of taking a risk is doing something, whether that's acting or taking an attitude, even in light of some kind of uncertainty, right? And so you have to acknowledge an error possibility in order for a risk to really make sense. Like, you're not taking a risk on whether 1 + 1 = 2 because that thing is certain for you, okay? And so I think this idea that faith is actually compatible with the error possibility of the object of faith being salient, it fits well with this idea that faith involves risks. You have to sort of consider the error possibility to assess the risks involved in faith. And if you just ignore the error possibilities, you can't really assess whether faith is worth the risk, okay? And so I think there is something to be said for this idea that faith is consistent with considering error possibilities. I don't know that this is going to be a fully satisfying answer, though, and I think there's still a puzzle. Like, consider someone who claims to be happily married, claims to have faith that their spouse is a good person, but they're constantly considering the error possibility. Is my spouse the wrong person? Did I marry the wrong person? There still seems something weird about that. You know what I mean? And so I'm worried there's more to say here. Love to hear what you think in the comments. I do think this is the most challenging of the three worries. So anyway, there's reasons to think faith is consistent with considering error possibilities, and there's reason to think that it isn't. And I'm still figuring all this out. Okay, great. So yeah, I've hoped to have motivated at least a little bit that credences could play the cognitive role in faith, and considered some objections to that, and then, at least sketched some replies. So if you want to contribute to the discussion or comment, if you have ideas for positive ways I might motivate credence-based faith, other objections to credence-based faith worth considering, or better ways I could reply to these objections, any of that feedback would be welcome, of course, among anything else. All right. Thanks for listening, and I hope you all have a great day.